Dr. Hewitt, I'm going to ask you next about the HIV look back. And I'm going to ask you first about some of the general background to it and then ask you about how it was managed at North London. So if we look, first of all, please, at CBLA 0001833. This is a document from April 1984, which you've referred to in your look-back witness statement as part of the background to HIV look-back. And we can see it's headed Surveillance of AIDS in relation to blood transfusion, notes of a meeting between Dr. Galbraith and Dr. McAvoy of CDSC, and then Dr. Gunson, 4th of April 1984. Now, you described this in your statement as appearing to be the first clear process by which the transfusion service with CDSC would identify at-risk donations and follow them up. It's right to understand, I think, this is prior to, obviously, the introduction of HTLV3 testing in 1985. And so these would be investigations triggered by a diagnosis of AIDS in a patient. Is that correct?
Yes, as I read it, yes, it is.
And so we can see paragraph 1 says that CDSC, so if a case is reported to CDSC, it will inform the appropriate regional transfusion director when a patient is diagnosed with AIDS. If the patient admits to donating blood, contact will be by telephone. Investigation will be undertaken to find out whether the person is registered as a donor. If the answer is no, CDSC will be informed. If the answer is yes, further action will be trace the fate of blood donations with respect to all products given during the previous 5 years. If plasma has been sent to BPL for fractionation, Dr. Lane will be informed as soon as possible. Hospitals should be asked to identify patients who receive the blood products, provide any information they have on subsequent progress of the patients and the name of the patient's family doctors. Subsequent to consultation with the defence organisations, a communication will be sent to the family doctor informing him of the circumstances, and a copy of the letter sent to CDSC who will carry out any further follow-up. CDSC should be kept informed of progress. So, sorry, Paul, can we just have the whole of section 1 on the screen just before we look at section 2? So it would, in terms of the regional transfusion directors or blood transfusion services involvement, they would be notified by CDSC of a case, ascertain if they could that whether the patient had been a donor, trace the donations, and then contact the hospitals to whom blood or components made from those donations had been supplied. As I read 1.3.3 and 1.3.4, although this is talking about identifying the patients who'd received the blood products, it doesn't appear to contain any provision for the patients themselves to be informed, certainly not by the blood transfusion service, but actually at all. It appears to be the communication with the family doctor, and then presumably it's left with the family doctor as to whether they contact the patient. Do you know any more about how this process worked than what we see set out here?
No, I don't. And I'm not even certain if I knew about this document.
Do you recall whether from June 1984, when you joined North London, through to the autumn of 1985, when the HIV look-back began, whether the North London Centre was ever contacted by CDSC to be told of a patient with AIDS and asked to ascertain if that patient had been a donor?
I don't recall any instance of that.
And the diagnosis appears to be one of AIDS,
yes,
as opposed to anything less, like AIDS-related complex or symptoms suggestive of, or
yes,
anything of that sort.
That's what's suggested in the document, yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
You've referred in your witness statement to some other documents, including some which look at what happened in terms of following up a donor who donated in Wessex, and whose donations were subsequently used in a number of both BPL concentrates and transfusions. I'm not going to ask you further about that, so we hope that we'll pick that up in a presentation in relation to the Wessex Regional Transfusion Centre in the new year. What I want then to do is pick up what was decided in relation to a look-back exercise once it became known that HTLV3 testing would be available
Yes.
and would be introduced in autumn of 1985. So if we go to DHSC 40406, this is a document dated the 11th of July 1985, a report from the Working Party of the Regional Transfusion Directors Committee, and it details largely the process that would be followed in relation to the introduction of HTLV3 testing. But if we go to page 4, we've got paragraph 7, which talks about follow-up of recipients of previous donations given by donors found to be HTLV3 positive. Efforts will be made to determine the names of any patients who received blood and components from the donations taken during the past 5 years, and the information regarding the known or possible seropositivity of the donation given to the consultant in charge of the patient. If plasma from any of the donations was sent for fractionation, full follow-up of all patients receiving coagulation factor concentrates may be difficult or impossible, since patients suffering from haemophilia A and B are being investigated for anti-HTLV3 at present. It is recommended that no additional follow-up be carried out. So, in relation to haemophilia patients, the arrangements of follow-up did not encompass them. Is that right?
That's correct, but I cannot remember now whether we would still have notified BPL of plasma donations which had been sent to them that originated from donors who were later diagnosed as HIV positive. I cannot remember that.
In any event, from the perspective of the blood transfusion centres, paragraph 7.1 encompasses what you were supposed to do. Yes. By reference to what became known as the HIV look back. You would look back for a period of 5 years to try and identify all donations and identify, obviously dependent upon what hospitals information was held, identify patients who had been transfused with blood or blood components or products from that donation.
Yes.
And I think there's a reference to in some of the documents to a possibility of a 3 to 5 year period, but it was a 5-year look back that was identified in the end. And that reflected what was thought to be the position in relation to how long or over what period of time people within the United Kingdom might have had HTLV3.
Yes, I think there were arguments that 5 years from 1985 was too long, but the 5 years was what was decided.
So that was the recommendation of this working party, and then if we go to PRSE 0002628. This is later in July 1985. It's a meeting of the Expert Advisory Group on AIDS, 30th of July 1985. And if we turn to page 5, the top paragraph, we can see there the heading follow-up of blood donations previously given by donors who are identified as positive for HTLV3, paper by the department. And then, there's a name redacted, I'm not for the moment sure why, said that the screening subcommittee had recommended that the haematologist in charge of the hospital blood bank should be informed if it was believed that an earlier donation could have transmitted HTLV3 infection. The haematologist would be asked to identify the recipient of the suspect donation and to inform the clinician in charge of the case when the blood had been transfused. The blood transfusion service was aware of the importance of good record keeping to enable the follow-up of donations. It was suggested that these follow-up investigations would provide a good opportunity to check on the transmission of the virus between spouses and from female to male, and the National Registry would be useful. Members agreed with the subcommittee's recommendations and considered that it would be up to the clinician in charge of the patient to decide on what subsequent investigations should be made. It was also agreed that, although there might be practical difficulties, the follow-up for donation should go back a minimum of 5 years from the date of the donation. So that's actually talking about a minimum of 5 years. In any event, that is the Expert Advisory Group on AIDS essentially deciding that this should happen. Is that right?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And then if we look at your look-back witness statement, WITN 310106, and we go to page 67, we just pick it up at paragraph 187. You refer in the previous paragraph to some comments from Dr. Tedder on behalf of Dr. Contreras at an eager meeting in November 1985. And then you say this: the comments by Dr. Tedder reflect an important difficulty with what NBTS could achieve by screening of blood donations. The NBTS could only screen donations from active blood donors. Donor education and encouragement of those who recognise themselves to be at risk of HIV infection to self-exclude from blood donation had been extremely successful, so that by the time that screening of blood donations commenced in October 1985, very few HIV-positive donors were detected. The HIV status of those who had self-excluded would remain unknown unless reports were made when any such individual was found to be HIV-positive outside the blood donation setting. We therefore had to rely on clinicians and or seropositive individuals themselves to come forward and inform the blood service. Only then could look back on such donations be possible. So is it right to understand that the look back was limited to investigating what had happened to earlier donations from donors who, after October 1985 or 23rd of September 1985 at North London, had donated blood, their donations had been tested, found to be HTLV3 positive. And it would be those cases that would be the subject of the look back. Is that right?
Yes, so it was a targeted look back.
And so for those donors who in 1984 or 1985 had not come forward because the leaflet or the call-up cards or the posters had successfully deterred them from donating, but who might have donated previously and their donation might well have led to the transmission of HIV, the look back would not cover those.
Exactly.
Well,
And that
I think it does say at the end, you do say at the end, that you would look back on such donations, only then could look back on such donations be possible. That might occur when they did come forward later on through a different route. They wouldn't come forward through your testing or through donors, but they'd come to your attention.
Yes, we had to rely on clinicians or the individuals themselves to inform us, and then we could undertake an investigation.
So this would depend upon somebody somewhere in the system saying, thank you for coming and you've got HIV and this is a problem. Have you ever donated blood?
Precisely.
That would be necessary, and then they'd have to, if the person said yes, they'd have to report that to you, and you could then do the tracing.
With that individual's permission.
Did that ever happen?
Yes, it did happen.
To what extent did it happen?
Infrequently.
And so you've described, I think, the HIV look back elsewhere in your statement as being small scale. For, as I understand it, really for the reason that's set out here.
Yes.
So could you then just explain to us how it worked in practice at North London?
Yes. So when a blood donor was confirmed as HIV positive, having managed the donor, as I described earlier, we would then have a process of starting the look back. So first of all, establishing was it a first-time donor or had this, in which case no look back was necessary. If there had been previous donations, we would then establish the identity of the previous donations. From the records, we would identify what blood components had been prepared from those donations and whether any plasma had been forwarded to BPL. Identify the fate of the blood components. So if they'd been issued to a hospital for use, which hospital they'd been issued to, and then I would send a letter to the consultant in charge of the blood transfusion laboratory at that hospital to say the donor of this donation has now been identified as HIV positive. we recommend that the fate of this donation is traced. And I can't remember at what stage and what wording we said, but consideration given to notifying and offering testing to the recipient. And we definitely asked for an outcome to be reported back to us.
Can you recall even approximately in what proportion of cases where you made contact with the hospital transfusion laboratory, hospital blood bank for that reason, the outcome was reported back to you?
In the majority of cases, because we would pursue it until we had an outcome. But I have to say that I can't remember at what point we refined the process. Because from the very point that the HIV was not common in 1980 and 1981, going back 5 years all at once was pursuing some donations which may not have been a risk. And so we refined it by going back sequentially. So we do the most recent donation first. And if we got a positive outcome for that there was a infected recipient, we would then go back to the next previous one, and so on. If there was no outcome for the most recent donation, either because the recipient had died or because the recipient was not tested, we would then go back to the previous one until we had 2 consecutive negatives. And then we would stop there. We wouldn't go back for the whole 5 years.
So the expectation was that the hospital, once notified by you, would ascertain how the donation had been used.
Yes.
If it hadn't been used, would report that back to you.
Yes.
So that you would know that was the case. You could essentially cross that one off.
Yes.
But in terms of what then happened in relation to the recipient, assuming that the what you'd supplied had been used, other than chasing the hospital, you were in the hands of the hospital as to what steps they took.
Yes.
And you would have had no direct dealings with the recipient.
Not in these early days. We certainly did at a later time. We would take that role on as well, if we were asked to.
Can I then just ask you to look at a handful of documents in relation to this? First of all, NHBT 005... before we do that, in relation to the question the chair asked you, so for cases other than those of the donors who came
Yes.
forward from the autumn of 1985 onwards, those who donated previously but not returned, where you were reliant upon somebody else initiating a report back
Yes.
to you, was there ever any guidance or publication or encouragement from the Department of Health or Chief Medical Officer or anything that you're aware of that steered clinicians into asking that question, have you ever been a blood donor?
No, and I've thought about this because you will see that Dr. Tedder had raised the question at EGA, and there was a reluctance. There was a reluctance in the sexual health clinics to be asking the question, and there was definitely in the 1980s there was definitely a huge concern about confidentiality and about the clinics prided themselves on the confidentiality of the information between themselves and their patients, and asking a patient, "Oh, can we send your name to the blood service?" I think was completely against how they were operating. So, as I think I said in my statement, some clinicians were sympathetic, but it happened very rarely. And I personally think that if there had been some guidance from somewhere saying, look, this is a good thing that should be done and it will help protect other people, then it might have been something which would have been taken on board.
So if we then go to NHBT 0057880, this is an extract from it looks like a presentation at an International AIDS conference in 1988 in Stockholm, look back experience of a UK blood transfusion centre, you, M. Moore and Dr. Barbara. And then it talks about objective to trace past recipients who might have received blood components infectious with HIV, Methods, donations were traced for 3 categories of donors. Current donors found positive for anti-HIV. And then ex-donors reported positive. That's the category we've just been discussing.
Yes.
And then 3 donors implicated in cases of transfusion-transmitted HIV. What does that third category cover?
So that category is where a clinician or a hospital blood transfusion laboratory has reported a patient infected with HIV who's had a previous history of blood transfusion and therefore investigated, as in the jaundice inquiries, and in where we have identified a donor who would be likely to be the source of that infection, we then investigated the other donations from that donor.
Is that reverse look back?
Yes.
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 And then hospitals were notified of involved blood components, traced their fate, and blood samples were obtained from living recipients wherever possible. And then you set out some results there. I'm going to look at a document which has more detail about some of the results. And then conclusions. These investigations are time-consuming. Hospital records are often deficient. The benefit produced by these inquiries has been little, but 3 blood recipients have been identified as seropositive and spread to their sexual partners, possibly averted. What did you mean by saying the benefit produced by these inquiries has been little?
On reflection, I think one could argue with that statement, because I think for those 3 recipients, there would have been benefits, there would have been disbenefits, but those individuals would have been identified and then would have been able to benefit from treatments when they became available. And as it does say there, onward spread to their contacts could be averted. So I would think that that statement that it had been little was not very wise.
And then if we can look at a report on cases produced by you, DHSC 0006351_032. This is, I think, a report from May of 1993. That's a date which appears on page 14. We don't need to go to it. And we can see it's entitled Investigation of Possible Transmission of HIV by Blood Transfusion, and you're recorded at the bottom as being the author. If we go over the page, we've got the abstract. Objective to identify the transmission of HIV by blood donated from individuals subsequently identified to be infected with HIV. We then have a description of the design. And then if we go a little further down the page, subjects, 25 donors identified as HIV positive, 18 detected through routine screening at the North London Blood Transfusion Centre, and 7 notified to the centre by the donor or an outside agency. So that's 7 that have come to your attention other than through your look-back exercise.
No, other than from screening?
Yes, sorry, yes. So other than through the exercise that had been envisaged by EGA in 1985.
Yes.
22 recipients thought to have been infected with HIV through blood transfusion. Main outcome measures evidence of HIV infection in the recipient. Results, 5 HIV-infected recipients were identified who'd not previously been known to be infected. In addition, the RTC became aware of 2 recipients known to be anti-HIV positive but previously unreported. All infected recipients were transfused before 1985 with unscreened blood or components. Of the possible transfusion-transmitted HIV infections, 1/3 were considered not due to transfusion, 1/3 thought likely without the identification of a culprit donor, and 5 donors were identified as likely to have been responsible for 6 reported cases. 1 case could not be investigated through lack of records, and 1 is still under investigation. The lack of records, was that a lack of records held at the hospitals?
I don't recall it now.
Conclusions, investigations failed to reveal any infection arising after screening of blood donations commenced in 1985. Overall, 42% of identifiable recipients died within 6 months of transfusion. 8 of 32, 25% living recipients were infected with HIV. 5 of these were newly detected through the investigation. Laboratory record keeping was generally deficient prior to 1985. Accurate recording of transfusion details in patient medical records remains a conspicuous problem up to the date of the report. So that's, as at 1993, it's still a problem, is that right?
Yes.
The investigation confirms the exceedingly small chance of transmission of HIV by transfusion of screened blood and blood components in the UK. So is it right to understand that all the cases that you were describing in this report that were transfusion-transmitted cases occurred before the introduction of screening in the autumn of 1985?
That's correct. And the reference to laboratory record keeping was hospital laboratory record keeping.
And then we can see over the page that there's a more detailed account of the process. I'm not going to go through the detail of that. But if we go to page 11, we just pick it up under the heading discussion. The investigation of possible transfusion-transmitted infection is extremely laborious and time-consuming. Investigation must be both thorough and methodical. This involves work for the RTC, hospitals, GPs and FHSAs, that's Family Health Service Authorities, yeah. Meticulous checking of records at the RTC and hospital laboratory is necessary to ensure that the relevant donation is traced to the correct recipients and recorded in the patient's medical notes. It is not uncommon to find that a hospital laboratory has records of issuing a donation for a particular recipient, but the medical notes contain no information about the donations transfused. Such an omission obviously leaves room for doubt when investigating possible cases of transfusion-transmitted infection. Hospital laboratory record keeping has generally much improved since the health circular relating to record keeping and stock control, HC 84/7. On the other hand, audits of blood transfusion practice continue to show gross deficits in the recording of information in medical notes. So this would appear to, I think, bear out what others have spoken to, that whilst the records within the hospital blood bank might have information about the donation and to whom the donation was supposed to have been issued as an individual patient, the deficiency, or the main deficiency, was in the patient's own medical records. Is that right?
Yes, I mean, it was felt important to confirm that when the blood transfusion laboratory had issued a unit for a particular patient, that it had actually been transfused to that patient. And, mistakes did happen. Sometimes blood was given to the wrong patient, and it was unusual. But if you're going to be doing this sort of investigation, you want to have as much confirmation as you can do that you have identified the correct person. And because we know mistakes occur, we would like to see not only the blood transfusion laboratory have got a fate for the donation, but that that person's medical records also have that recorded.
If the medical records didn't have that information, but nonetheless the hospital records showed the issue to that patient, was your expectation still that the hospital would then follow through with contacting the patient through their clinician or through whatever means was appropriate?
Yeah, I've been thinking about this. I think with HIV, and it was certainly the case with the hepatitis C look back, which I know you'll come to, we would advise that it would be pursued with the proviso that the definitive evidence that it went into that patient was not there, but it had to be assumed that it had gone to that patient, and therefore it should be dealt with on that basis. And I know assumptions are dangerous, but it was likely to have gone to that person.
And then it continues in the next paragraph. The majority of cases of transfusion-transmitted HIV infection arise from blood transfusions given in 1982 to 4. As record keeping was not satisfactory at that time and usually related to non-computerised systems, it can often be difficult and time-consuming to retrieve information within the RTC, in the hospital laboratory and in the medical records department. Furthermore, recipients can be difficult to trace if no longer under hospital care. In many instances, recipients have moved home and are no longer registered with the GP caring for them at the time of transfusion. As contact is made first through a doctor, a significant amount of time is spent in correspondence with FHSAs to trace the appropriate GP. Sometimes the RTC has written to 5 or 6 doctors in an individual case, haematologist, surgeon, physician, referring physician, GP, without any of them wishing to take responsibility for notifying the recipient. Not only does this cause extra work, but it considerably delays the investigation. On occasion, several reminder letters have been necessary before the RTC has been supplied with relevant information. The period between initiation and completion of an investigation can be as long as 1 year. The more distant the transfusion, the longer the investigation will take. Again, just pausing there. If this is a recipient who has received infected blood and has been infected with HIV, but doesn't know, that delay in them being contacted by a clinician, whether it's their GP or haematologist, whoever it might be, may mean a period of time in which others have been, family members, partners have been put at risk, presumably.
Precisely. And perhaps it's worth just saying at this point, and this was a long time ago, there was no way nationally you could check whose GP, who a patient belonged to a GP. Now there's a database and you can just find it. We had to write to the FHSA of the GP who the patient was last registered with, and they would have to tell us where they'd passed on the patient's records, to which other FHSA they'd passed on the records, and then we'd have to contact that FHSA and say, is this patient registered with a GP in your area? And it could go on like that.
And then it continues, the identification of recipients not previously known to be infected with HIV is a benefit to them and their families, since awareness of HIV infection leads to the prospect of earlier and prophylactic treatments which may prolong the survival of the infected person. Furthermore, secondary transmission might be prevented. Payment from the government to those infected with HIV through blood transfusions is an added stimulus on the blood transfusion service to identify as far as possible all those individuals who may have been infected through this route. It is of continuing concern to the BTS that there is no mechanism for checking whether a lapsed donor has subsequently been reported as HIV positive through the confidential reporting system operated by the CDSC. The failure of professionals to ask individuals diagnosed as infected with HIV about prior blood donation and then to notify the RTC also leads to missed opportunities to identify all recipients infected with HIV by transfusion. So that's the issue I asked you about, Dr. Hewitt, a few moments ago. Our investigation of 90 individual blood components led to the identification of 5 HIV seropositive recipients who were in good health and not previously suspected to be infected. Anti-HIV screening of blood donations commenced in 1985, and it is quite likely that there are other infected recipients transfused before 1985 who have not yet been identified. They are only likely to come to light when they develop symptoms which prompt suspicion of HIV infection. Now, you were writing this in 1993, so in 1993 you thought that there were still people who had not been identified through this route?
Yes.
And then you go on to give some of the figures which we saw in the abstract at the beginning, so I won't repeat that. I then just want to ask you, if I may, still on the HIV look back, about a handful of other documents from starting with 2 documents from Dr. Gunson. The first is LHBT 00155578_001, please. So this is a report from Dr. Gunson, anti-HIV-1 testing of blood donations in the UK 1985 to 1989. It's dated, it's on page 4, we don't need to go to it, Paul, 19th of February 1990. It's largely looking at the outcome of the screening tests, but I just wanted to pick up a passage that you referred to in your statement, which is at page 3. At least I think you referred to this one in your statement. It's penultimate paragraph on the page. Investigations of the recipients of products from seronegative donations from a donor who subsequently became seropositive have not in general been carried out. In those that have been followed up, the patient has either succumbed to the primary disease or has been seronegative. One instance was found in Glasgow where 2 patients seroconverted following the transfusion of products from a donor who was anti-HIV negative in July 1986 and positive in October 1986. Am I right in understanding from this and from your evidence that this is the first documented instance of window period transmission?
That's correct.
And that was the significance of this entry?
Yes. But could I just add that I'm very surprised by the first sentence, because definitely that was something we did at North London. We investigated the recipients of seronegative donations from a donor who later tested positive.
In case those donations have been given
In the window
during
period.
the window period.
Yes.
But this would suggest that
It was not
that's
general
not
practice.
general practice
Yes.
in other transfusion centres. And then if we go to NHBT 0003763, this is another document from Dr. Gunson. It's dated September 1990 on its last page. Investigation of donations transmitting HIV and hepatitis B surface antigen. We'll see if we look, the second paragraph, Dr. Gunson says, in order to ensure that each RTC has an operating procedure to handle these investigations, I've recently received from RTCs the procedures employed in investigating such instances. Below, I've analysed the response from two aspects. One, the initial stages of the investigation so that BPL can be informed of any plasma donations that may be at risk. Two, follow-up of the implicated donor so that she can be removed from the panel of active donors. And then Dr. Gunson goes on to set out, in summary form, the procedures at each RTC. North London's is at page 5. Through onto page 6. Again, without wanting to go through it centre by centre, is it right to understand from this document that there were a range of different procedures in different centres, so not everyone was doing it in the same way?
I'm perfectly sure that was the case, and I think this reflects the fact that it was not a national organisation.
And indeed, that's the observation you make in your look-back statement. I don't think we need to put it back on screen, Paul, but what you say by reference to this document, and it's paragraph 209 of your statement, the variation of procedure demonstrated highlights the lack of a nationally managed blood service. Highlights that the lack of a nationally managed blood service in England limited Dr. Gunson's ability to influence practices. He only had persuasive authority. This caused real difficulty in implementing national schemes like the Look Back.
Exactly.
And then can I ask you to look at a report from Dr. Janet Mortimer at NHBT 00155574_002. So Dr. Mortimer was at the part of the PHLS at CDSC,
Yes.
and this report is dated the 11th of September 1990. It's headed MBTS Look Back, October 1985 to December 1989, and she is here describing the follow-up of donations and what's been found. So we can see in the second paragraph, the first 4.25 years of routine anti-HIV screening of all blood donations identified 67 positive donors who had given blood before, repeat donors. And then the next paragraph records that at the time of preparing this report, information about the follow-up of previous donations from these donors had been received for 64 of them. They'd been given at least 419 donations between them, the range being 1 to 73. Most of the donations involved in this look-back had been made before routine anti-HIV testing started, but 39 of them had been given since the introduction of screening. And then she goes on to talk about the difficulties of follow-up because of patient deaths from underlying causes, difficulties in identifying recipients and reluctance to alarm patients. Follow-up has not been complete. Therefore, the possibility that HIV transmissions from screened blood have taken place cannot be ruled out. And then there's a summary in the last paragraph, but it's made clear that it doesn't cover all recorded transfusion-associated transmissions of HIV from RTCs in England, Wales and Northern Ireland. If we just go over the page, it picks up then on the observation that you'd made and that Dr Gunston had made about there being a difference in practice. Dr Mortimer says, greater uniformity of practice seems desirable. I would like to suggest the following for consideration. One, that when more than one transfusion centre is concerned, the centre where a positive donor is identified as the one responsible for collating the look-back data. To what extent had that been or was that a problem that you were aware of?
I don't recall any look-backs that I carried out that involved a donor who donated at another centre.
And then two, that wherever possible, look-back continues retrospectively through the previous donations until either A, all have been investigated, or B, an anti-HIV negative recipient is identified, unless there's any doubt about the accuracy of the record keeping, which makes further look-back desirable. Now, I think when this was subsequently considered by the expert advisory group on AIDS, their recommendation was that you continue until you've got 2 anti-HIV negative recipients. Is that right? And that's the practice you described.
That's right, and I think that's what I said earlier. But in practice, it was so unusual to actually find two negative recipients, because in general, there would be a recipient who died, there would be a recipient who couldn't be located. But that was, yes.
And then 3, that look-back should be applied in the same way to all donors, however discovered to be anti-HIV positive, and not only to those identified by donation screening. I think in principle you'd agree with that. You've told us the difficulties because it was dependent upon others bringing the cases to your attention. Is that right?
That's right, but I can't see why you would not investigate if you were informed a donor was now HIV positive. I can't think of any reason why you would treat that any differently from a donor picked up on screening.
But does the inclusion of this recommendation here suggest that perhaps not all centres were
It certainly
doing that?
implies that, yet.
Can I then just pick the issue up by looking at NHBT 00151008. Now, we're now in May of 1992, and this is a letter from Dr Gunston to regional transfusion directors about the HIV and blood transfusion/tissue transfer payment scheme. Is it right to understand that this is referring to what became known as the Eileen Trust?
Yes, that's right.
I've been asked by the Department of Health to contact you with respect to the identification of any possible blood donations which may be implicated in transmitting HIV to patients as a result of blood transfusion. Could you please identify the blood donors you found to be confirmed HIV positive, antibody positive since the commencement of testing, and send a list of the donation numbers of the previous donations, if any, from these donors, together with the dates of delivery, to the consultant haematologist at the hospital concerned. Some of you may already have this information available from look-back programmes. The DH are anxious that no potential beneficiaries are overlooked, since these extend to spouse and dependent children. Even if you're aware that the patient has died subsequently to the transfusion, the data should still be forwarded to the hospital. You've said in your statement that this effectively represented a further attempt to look back, prompted by the introduction of this payment scheme.
Yes.
But you also say in your statement that a distinction was the direct involvement of the chief medical officer by this stage, which provided more weight than Dr Gunston trying to persuade colleagues.
There's certainly the implication in the second paragraph that not all centres had been carrying out look-back, certainly as we'd been carrying it out at North London. I was surprised to see that, but it does imply that this is now a further effort to try and ensure that that look-back was carried out.
And we can probably pick it up most quickly just by looking, as the final exercise for today, at your statement. WITN 3101006, page 85, please, Paul. So I'd missed out a step in the correspondence. We can see it referred to at the bottom of this page. So shortly before Dr Gunston's letter, the chief medical officer wrote to all hospital consultants, all GPs, etc., etc. We see the list of the recipients of the letter referred to in your witness statement regarding this scheme, asking for help in identifying patients who might be entitled to payments under the scheme, and then it refers to how regional transfusion directors will be asked to check records. So whereas if we look further down the page, let me show you the rest of your statement and then ask you the question. So bottom of the page, 232, this was the comment in your statement I was asking you about, Dr. Hewitt. This correspondence marks a further attempt at look back prompted by the widening of the payment scheme. A distinction from the earlier approach, however, is the direct involvement and direction by the CMO to all clinicians. This provided considerably more weight than Dr. Gunson trying to convince clinical colleagues by persuasion. Now, please tell me if I'm wrong. I had read this as your observation that hitherto you and other regional transfusion centres were effectively dependent upon clinicians in hospitals cooperating with your requests for information in order to complete the look-back exercise. And the point you were making here was that this was now backed up by a direct request from the Chief Medical Officer to all clinicians in hospitals to cooperate. Is that right?
That's right. But I think, personally, from the North London point of view, we had not encountered a problem with cooperation from our clinicians.
So I note the time, and I'm going to move next to the HCV look back, but I don't recommend commencing it at 4:32.
Well, let's then look forward to the look back. And do that at 10 o'clock tomorrow morning.
Thank you, sir.
10 o'clock.